Hey guys, tonight we step into a dimly lit room that smells faintly of varnish, lamp oil, and the nervous sweat of people about to sit perfectly still for far too long. This is not your modern photo booth where you smile, blink, and get a dozen takes. No, this is a 19th century photography studio, where portraits are rituals of patience, dignity, and oddly enough, borrowed facial hair. You look around and see racks of props, velvet curtains, and yes, rows of false beards dangling like the strangest wig shop you've ever stumbled into. And here's your cheeky reality check. If you think holding still for a 2-second smartphone selfie is painful, you probably wouldn't survive 10 minutes with your chin locked in place while wearing a beard that smells like someone else's pipe smoke. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And go ahead, let me know your location and local time in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where in the world people are tuning in from, whether you're listening on a midnight shift or drifting off at sunrise. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle across the wooden floorboards of the studio, brushing past velvet drapes and gilt chairs. At the back wall, a shelf gleams with brass lenses, their glass polished to catch every beam of sunlight. Tripods stand like stiff sentinels. And beside them, a peculiar sight, beards thick, curled, bushy, hanging neatly as though waiting for their next client. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Early photographic studios often doubled as theatrical workshops. They supplied props, costumes, and backdrops to help clients present themselves not as they were, but as they wished to be remembered. Facial hair was a particularly potent symbol, and since not every man could grow a commanding beard, studios were only too happy to provide one. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some photographers actually kept catalogs where clients could flip through samples of whiskers like ordering from a menu. Would Sir prefer the Napoleon mustache, or perhaps the Dickensian full beard? Imagine choosing your face the way you choose a side dish. Historians still argue whether these fake beards were primarily about vanity or practicality. Were they offered so men could look more fashionable, or were they meant to disguise the awkward stillness of a chin held rigid for a long exposure? Some scholars point to cultural ideals of masculinity. Others insist it was nothing more than clever stagecraft to stop wobbly faces from ruining plates. The sensory details close in, the faint tang of collodion chemicals, the dusty warmth of sunlight filtering through skylights, the rustle of fabric as assistants adjust backdrops. A chair stands ready with a head brace, a cold iron support hidden behind the sitter to keep them still. And beside it, a box of whiskers, absurdly solemn, waiting to bestow dignity at a moment's notice. And here's your gentle joke. You imagine a nervous young man telling the photographer, "I can't grow a beard." The photographer pats his shoulder and replies, "Nonsense, sir, we rent them by the hour." By the time you lower yourself into the heavy studio chair, you realize the story of early photography isn't just about light and shadow. It's also about performance, props, illusions, and beards that never belonged to the faces they adorned. The velvet curtains close behind you, and suddenly the studio feels like a stage where every detail must be controlled, not just light and backdrop, but faces too. You settle into the heavy wooden chair, and the photographer murmurs instructions with the gravity of a priest preparing a ceremony. Sit still, chin up, eyes steady. Then, with a conspiratorial glance, he reaches for something hanging on the wall, a false beard. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Early photographic exposures often took anywhere from 30 seconds to several minutes. That meant sitters had to remain absolutely still, and the tiniest twitch, especially in the soft flesh of the chin, could blur a plate. A pasted-on beard or mustache not only disguised motion but also gave definition to the jawline, reducing the risk of ghostly blurs in an era before fast shutters. You can almost feel it. The bristle of horsehair or wool against your skin, held in place with sticky gum arabic. It itches instantly, and you're tempted to scratch, but the assistant behind you gently adjusts an iron head brace, locking your skull in place. The false beard, ridiculous as it feels, becomes part of the stillness strategy, a mask to hide human imperfection under long exposure. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some studios supplied entire sets of facial hair in different shapes and shades, allowing them to be swapped midday as clients came and went. A balding clerk in the morning might leave looking like a rugged patriarch. By afternoon, the same beard might reappear on a student hoping to look scholarly. In a way, the beards lived longer than the photographs. Historians still argue whether photographers themselves truly believed in the technical benefits of these props, or whether they leaned on them as theatrical flourishes. Were fake beards practical tools to manage exposure times, or were they stagecraft excuses to help sitters feel important and fashionable? The debate persists, with evidence pointing both ways. The sensory details deepen, the cloying sweetness of gum arabic, the tickle of false whiskers against your lip, the heat of studio lamps pressing down on your shoulders. Outside the skylight, dust motes float lazily in sunbeams, but inside, time feels heavy and precise. You can hear the slow hiss of chemicals poured onto a plate, every second adding weight to the silence. And here's your gentle joke. You imagine a sitter sneezing halfway through an exposure, sending the false beard flying into the camera's frame. The final portrait would look less like a dignified patriarch and more like a startled gentleman being attacked by a small raccoon. By the time the exposure is finally finished, you realize the beard wasn't just a disguise. It was a survival tactic for both sitter and photographer, hiding the little betrayals of human twitch and time beneath a mask of whiskers. The studio smells faintly of burnt oil and warm varnish, and you're still aware of that itchy hairpiece clinging to your jaw. It's not just about staying still, though. You soon realize there's another layer to this curious practice. The false beard isn't only a technical crutch, it's a badge of borrowed identity. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In the 19th century, beards surged into fashion after decades of clean-shaven trends. By the 1850s and 1860s, a thick set of whiskers was practically shorthand for manliness, wisdom, and respectability. Politicians, poets, explorers, all the great figures sported some variation of facial hair. For those unlucky souls who couldn't grow their own or who feared their patchy attempts would be immortalized forever on glass, photography studios provided a quick fix. You picture a young man sitting nervously, cheeks still smooth as parchment, while the photographer affixes a borrowed mustache. In the final image, he looks 10 years older and far more distinguished, at least on paper. His family back home could proudly hang the portrait above the mantel, convinced their boy had matured into a gentleman overnight. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some studios even advertise their ability to make clients appear more imposing. This often meant nothing more than adding whiskers and perhaps draping a borrowed cloak or military-style sash across their shoulders. For a modest fee, you could purchase instant gravitas, the 19th century equivalent of applying a filter that screams serious adult energy. Historians still argue whether these beards were more about vanity or social necessity. Did sitters truly want to appear older and more masculine to impress peers, or were they responding to a cultural wave that equated hair with authority? Some scholars suggest a bit of both. Fashion fueled demand, while insecurity made the beards indispensable. The sensory world sharpens, the sharp snap of the camera's plate holder being slid into place, the scent of damp wool coats, stacked near the wall, the rasp of a photographer's voice urging, "Steady, steady." Your lips itch under the hairpiece, but you know this is your one chance at a portrait that screams gravitas. Outside, a passing cart rattles along cobblestones, while inside the studio time itself feels syrup-thick, drawn out by the exposure. And here's your gentle joke. You imagine a proud young sitter later telling friends, "Yes, that beard was all mine." Meanwhile, the studio's assistant is in the corner chuckling, polishing the same whiskers to paste onto tomorrow's next distinguished gentleman. By the time the plate is finally removed and the chemicals begin to capture your face, you realize you've just lived through a peculiar trick of the age. A rented beard, an instant upgrade in masculinity, and a photograph that whispers more about fashion than truth. The photographer clears his throat and steps back, carefully sliding the glass plate into its holder. You feel the clamp of the iron headrest lift from behind your skull, and only then do you notice how tense your shoulders have been. The beard still clings awkwardly, itching beneath your chin, and you realize it's doing more than lending you gravitas. It's reshaping your very face. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Early photographic lighting was unforgiving. Sunlight filtered through skylights or gas lamps fell harshly, flattening features and exaggerating flaws. A well-placed beard could cast subtle shadows across the jawline, disguising round cheeks or a double chin that no amount of posture could hide. For clients eager to appear slimmer, sterner, or simply more angular, a beard was as useful as any costume. You imagine the photographer tilting his head, squinting critically, then tugging the beard a little higher to create a line of shadow just so. Suddenly your face looks sharper, almost sculpted, as if the whiskers themselves were chiseling out a new identity. A stranger's hair has become your personal jawline contour, 19th century cosmetic surgery, but with glue and patience instead of scalpels. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some studios reportedly kept beards in varying sizes labeled not by style but by effect. Slimming. Beard, heroic. Beard, even one called the statesman. The same person might be photographed with 2 or 3 variations in a single sitting, then select whichever face best suited their ambitions. In other words, you could shop for jawlines. Historians still argue whether this practice was purely cosmetic or whether it had cultural undertones. Was the manipulation of facial shape about vanity alone, or did it echo deeper anxieties about status, class, and the visual rhetoric of respectability? The debate lingers in footnotes and faded studio ledgers, with some insisting it was little more than early airbrushing, others pointing to broader pressures of Victorian identity. The sensory landscape sharpens, warm light pouring through dusty panes, the faint squeak of boots shifting on floorboards, and the prickle of glue drying beneath your chin. You catch a glimpse in a tarnished mirror, and the reflection is startling, your cheeks leaner, your jaw more commanding, your face less yours and more a performance. And here's your gentle joke. You picture yourself explaining to friends, "Yes, I've been dieting." Meanwhile, the real secret is tucked in a box at the studio. Slimming beard, medium length, returns slightly itchy. By the time the exposure is finished, you feel the odd weight of those false whiskers, both physical and symbolic. They're no longer just props, they're tools of transformation, proof that even in the age of slow photography, image could be manipulated with a tug of hair and a dab of glue. You stretch your jaw as the assistant peels away the now itchy beard, its adhesive tack pulling faintly at your skin. The faint imprint it leaves behind feels like the memory of someone else's face. Outside the studio's thin windows, carriage wheels rattle past, but in here the rhythm belongs to commerce, the endless shuffle of sitters, each one buying not just a picture, but a version of themselves that will outlive them. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the 1860s, photography had exploded into mass culture through the carte de visite, a small, affordable portrait printed on thin cardboard, traded like social currency. Everyone from factory clerks to duchesses sat for these cards. To stand out in the flood of faces, studios offered every advantage they could: flattering backdrops, hand-painted skies, and yes, even rentable beards. You can almost hear the hustle, an assistant scurrying to reset the velvet curtain, a client flipping through a sample album thick with proud strangers, their whiskers strikingly similar. The carte de visite made celebrity styling democratic. For a few shillings, you too could look like a barrister, a poet, or a continental gentleman with opinions on art and absinthe. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some studios in London and Paris kept signature beards. Modeled after famous men, Victor Hugo's cascade, Garibaldi's fierce sweep, or Lincoln's dignified chin curtain. They were as instantly recognizable as a modern influencer's haircut. One Parisian photographer allegedly charged double for his Garibaldi special, boasting that it made even the meekest postman look like a revolutionary. Historians still argue whether this was imitation or aspiration. Were clients play-acting fame for the fun of it, or reaching for a kind of social camouflage in a class-obsessed age? The carte de visite market blurred those lines, a world where identity could be printed, traded, and admired like a business card of selfhood. The sensory detail surrounds you, the soft crackle of developing plates, the sweet acrid scent of silver nitrate, the scratch of pen nibs labeling names beneath fresh prints. A shelf of drying photographs gleams like tiles, every one a small illusion ready to circulate through parlors and wallets. The false beards hang drying beside them, patiently waiting for their next identity to inhabit. And here's your gentle joke. You imagine a wife showing her friend a portrait and whispering, "My husband looks so distinguished," while the friend leans in and murmurs, "Yes, dear, but that beard has been married 3 times already." By the time you step away from the viewing counter, you sense how powerfully the fake beard bridges vanity and technology. In an age before editing software, these props let ordinary people curate their image, one slow exposure at a time, each portrait a little performance of who they wish to be. You stand beside a table littered with odd instruments, tiny brushes, amber jars, coils of string, and a row of corked bottles that smell faintly of pine sap and sugar. The photographer's assistant dips a thin wooden stick into one jar, twirling it like honey, before dabbing the viscous goo along the edge of another false beard. "Hold still," he murmurs, his tone conspiratorial. "Spirit gum, it's the actor's secret." Here's your mainstream historical fact. Many early photographers borrowed techniques directly from the theater. Stage actors had long used spirit gum, a resin-based adhesive made from natural sap or gum arabic, to attach wigs, sideburns, and false beards for performances. Studios quickly adopted these tricks to keep props and hairpieces from slipping during long photographic sittings. You can smell it as he works, sharp, resinous, and faintly sweet, like the scent of pine needles crushed underfoot. When pressed against your skin, it tightens, tacky at first and then firm, sealing the beard in place as neatly as a stage disguise. For a moment you half expect applause. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some studios used stronger, homebrew concoctions that stuck so well they occasionally removed a bit of real skin when peeled off. Assistants whispered tips among themselves, rub in a touch of olive oil afterward to avoid the Monday redness, as it was jokingly called. Others powdered the glued beard with charcoal dust to dull the shine, giving it a more authentic look under the glaring skylights. Historians still argue whether the line between photographer and performer was ever truly distinct. Was the early studio an artistic laboratory or just a miniature theater with chemicals? Letters from photographers of the era reveal both, scientific pride and precision mixed with the sly delight of showmanship. A good portraitist, one boasted, was half chemist, half magician. The sensory layers build around you, the sticky tug of the adhesive on your chin, the scratch of coarse fibers brushing your collar, and the muffled echo of footsteps crossing wooden boards. Somewhere behind the curtain, someone sneezes, perhaps from the fumes of collodion or the peppery dust of powdered wigs. And here's your gentle joke. You imagine walking home later with the beard still attached, accidentally greeting your neighbors as a stranger. "Good evening," they'd reply uncertainly. "And who might you be?" By the time the photographer finishes adjusting the lighting, you realize the false beard isn't just a prop anymore. It's become a ritual tool in a world that blurred science and theater. You sit perfectly still as he counts down the seconds, every tick of his pocket watch suspended in amber light. When the exposure ends, he nods with quiet pride, as if both of you have just pulled off a small act of alchemy. You can feel the glue drying on your chin as another customer steps through the curtain. A man with calloused hands and a heavy accent, his boots caked in the kind of mud that travels with you for weeks. He removes his hat nervously, revealing a receding hairline and a kind of fatigue only found in people who've crossed an ocean. The photographer greets him warmly, ushering him toward the same chair where you just sat, and it's only then you realize. This is more than a portrait factory, it's an identity machine. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Photography studios in immigrant neighborhoods across London, New York, and Paris often doubled as gateways of self-presentation. A portrait could be mailed across continents, proof of one's new beginning. A false beard borrowed from the rack could turn a bewildered newcomer into a man of substance, ready to be believed when he wrote home about his new life. The photographer selects a modest, neatly trimmed beard, something respectable but not ostentatious, and fixes it carefully with spirit gum. The immigrant blinks, half amused, half awed. When the plate is exposed, he will no longer be the dock laborer he was yesterday but a respectable shopkeeper, a man of standing, even if only in silver nitrate. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some studios near Ellis Island and in East London kept small collections of uniforms, medals, and even fake monocles. Clients could rent not just beards, but entire identities. There were whispered jokes among photographers that half of Europe had been promoted by a costume and a clever pose before the boat had even docked. Historians still argue whether this transformation was exploitative or empowering. Were photographers preying on insecurity, selling dignity to those desperate to belong? Or were they collaborators in hope, giving their clients a way to shape the narrative of their new lives? The debate endures in archives filled with anonymous faces that look just a little too polished for the lives they likely led. The sensory details sharpen, the rasp of wool jackets against wood, the faint smell of tobacco clinging to coats, the quiet murmur of accents, Polish, Italian, Irish, mingling in the dim studio light. The immigrant stares at his reflection after the sitting, his lips twitching beneath borrowed whiskers. He smiles. For once, he looks like someone the world might take seriously. And here's your gentle joke. You imagine him walking home through the tenement district, forgetting to remove the beard, and startling his landlady. "Good heavens!" she'd cry. "When did you become such a gentleman?" By the time his portrait dries, the beard is already hanging on its peg again, ready for the next hopeful face. You watch the photographer wipe his hands on a rag, glance at the clock, and prepare another plate. The cycle continues, new lives, new stories, all carefully staged under glass and glue. The day drifts on, the lights slanting golden through the skylight as laughter seeps through the studio walls. You turn to find the source, a trio of young women in corseted dresses and lace gloves whispering excitedly near the costume rack. One of them, cheeks flushed with mischief, picks up a thick brown mustache and holds it under her nose. "Do I look terribly dashing?" she asks, and the others dissolve into giggles. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the 1870s, many photography studios offered novelty sittings, playful sessions where clients, especially women, posed in costume. Victorian society might have frowned upon cross-dressing in public, but within the safe confines of the studio, it became a cheeky game of make-believe. Photographers, eager for profit, encouraged it. Their props included cloaks, swords, hats, and inevitably a drawer full of false beards. The women strike poses one after another. One tips a top hat, another adopts a mock heroic stance with hand on chest. The photographer adjusts the curtain backdrop and chuckles, calling them his Three Musketeers. Under the long exposure, the laughter stills into composure, but you can sense it hovering there, suppressed giggles frozen forever in sepia. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some studios even advertised comic disguises for ladies, renting short, manageable mustaches to those curious about seeing themselves as men. One particularly adventurous London studio offered a full gentleman's package, complete with pipe, cane, and cravat. Rumor has it a suffragette group later reused the very same props for a series of disguised protest portraits. Historians still argue whether these sessions were harmless fun or quiet acts of rebellion. Were women simply amusing themselves, or were they experimenting with the boundaries of gender and respectability? The line blurs, especially in photographs where the glint in their eyes hints at something subversive behind the laughter. The sensory details surround you, the dry scent of powder, the faint rustle of skirts brushing wooden stools, and the photographer's reassuring voice counting down the exposure. The fake mustache tickles one woman's upper lip, and she bites her tongue to stifle a laugh. When the plate is done, they peel off their disguises and fan themselves, glowing with triumph. And here's your gentle joke. You imagine one of them showing the finished portrait to her fiancé later that week, saying, "I think you'll find I make quite the handsome fellow." By the time the women leave, the studio feels lighter somehow, less solemn, more alive. You realize the fake beards, those silly tufts of hair, have become tools of transformation not just for vanity, but for humor, curiosity, even quiet defiance. Within these walls, for the length of a long exposure, anyone can be anyone. The sunlight has dimmed to a honeyed glow when the next client arrives, a man in a threadbare military jacket with medals so tarnished they barely glint. His gait is stiff, his boots scuffed. He lays a small photograph on the counter, a younger version of himself, unscarred, bearded, proud. The photographer studies it in silence, then opens the drawer of false whiskers with a knowing nod. Here's your mainstream historical fact. After the Crimean War and the American Civil War, photography became entwined with remembrance. Veterans sat for portraits wearing borrowed or restored uniforms, often using props, swords, medals, and yes, beards, to recapture their former selves. A beard was more than a fashion. It was a symbol of honor and endurance, a visual shorthand for courage. You watch as the photographer selects a thick, iron-gray beard, brushing it gently before affixing it with careful precision. The veteran closes his eyes for a moment, perhaps remembering what it felt like to have one of his own before years of hardship or injury took it away. When he opens them again, his face has changed, not merely older, but fuller, restored, almost mythic. Here's the quirky tidbit. In some cities, veteran packages became a quiet specialty. Studios advertised that they could restore the appearance of former gallantry. They provided props, hairpieces, and even staged smoke to evoke a battlefield's haze. One ambitious photographer in Boston reportedly owned an entire trunk labeled heroic accessories. Inside were mustaches, saber handles, and cloth backdrops painted with distant cannons. Historians still argue whether these post-war portraits were therapy or theater. Were they attempts to heal trauma by reclaiming lost identities, or comforting illusions meant for loved ones back home? Letters and diary entries suggest both. For some men, the photograph was their final salute. For others, a quiet exorcism of the ghosts that followed them. The sensory details deepen, the faint click of the plate holder, the musk of old wool, the slow rhythm of the photographer's counting, steady, reverent. Outside, London's bustle fades. Inside, only stillness remains. The false beard glows faintly under the soft gaslight, lending the sitter an aura of solemn dignity. And here's your gentle joke. You imagine him later showing the portrait to his drinking mates, saying, "See? I told you I could still grow a fine beard," and them nodding politely, unwilling to spoil the illusion. By the time the session ends, the beard is back on its hook, its role played to perfection. You realize that, in its own peculiar way, each false whisker carries a trace of every story it's been part of, a collage of longing, pride, and performance. The photographs dry silently, preserving not just faces, but fragments of who their owners wanted to be remembered as. The next morning dawns gray and thin, the kind of light that seems hesitant to commit. You return to the studio to find it buzzing again, though this time the clientele looks curated. A man in a frock coat stands before an elaborate painted backdrop of pyramids and palm trees, and beside him, a photographer's assistant rummages through a chest marked ethnographic costumes. When the lid opens, out spills a tangle of turbans, shawls, and yes, beards of every conceivable texture. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the 1880s, photography had become a tool of empire. Studios produced ethnographic portraits for exhibitions, travel books, and private collections, often dressing European sitters in exotic garb to mimic colonial subjects. In these images, authenticity was an illusion. The studio manufactured diversity the same way it manufactured dignity, with props, costumes, and cleverly glued whiskers. You watch as the assistant selects a glossy black beard from a labeled drawer. Oriental number 3, and fastens it carefully under the sitter's chin. A headdress follows, then a robe. The result is an uncanny masquerade, a man who's never left London suddenly transformed into an imagined scholar from distant lands. The photographer beams, convinced he's captured something profound. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some studios marketed types of manhood portraits, offering everything from the Arab merchant to the Hindu sage, the Greek poet, and the Chinese mandarin. One Paris atelier even bragged of having 100 nations' worth of whiskers. Most were sewn from horsehair, dyed in batches, and occasionally reused so often that traces of glue and old makeup clung to them like ghosts of previous identities. Historians still argue whether these portraits were born from curiosity or condescension. Were they naive attempts at understanding a wider world, or complicit acts of stereotyping disguised as art? The debate lingers in museum archives, where anonymous faces stare back under borrowed hair, their stories long since stripped of truth. The sensory world presses close, the smell of incense sprinkled for effect, the swish of silk robes against wooden stools, the sticky warmth of spirit gum brushed along the jaw. You can almost hear the whisper of the beard being pressed into place, the little gasp of satisfaction from the sitter as the mirror confirms the transformation. And here's your gentle joke. You imagine him later showing off the portrait to friends, declaring, "My travels were enlightening," when the furthest he's actually ventured is Camden Town. By the time the photograph is exposed and hung to dry, the false beard has done its work again, bridging fantasy and vanity, turning imagination into a tangible artifact. You realize that every photograph here, no matter how absurd, feeds the same desire, to be seen as something larger, nobler, or more mysterious than the everyday self. The studio grows quieter as afternoon drifts toward evening. The sunlight dulls to amber, and the photographer's sighs grow heavier. He's had his fill of adults pretending to be generals and explorers. Then, the door opens again, and in toddles a small boy clutching his mother's skirts, eyes wide as saucers. You recognize that look, the unblinking terror of every child dragged into an unfamiliar place told, "Just sit still and don't move." Here's your mainstream historical fact. Photographing children in the 19th century was a logistical nightmare. Long exposure times made it nearly impossible to capture fidgeting little ones without blurs, smudges, or ghostly double images. Studios developed every trick imaginable to keep them calm and still, from hidden braces under the chair to mothers crouched behind curtains, holding them upright. You can almost hear the gentle pleading, "Just 1 minute, sweetheart, don't blink, don't wiggle." But the child squirms, tugs at his collar, then bursts into tears. The photographer, remarkably calm, reaches for a different kind of prop, a tiny beard. The mother gasps, the boy giggles, and suddenly the tension dissolves. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some studios kept miniature mustaches and chin tufts precisely for this purpose. The absurdity made children laugh, and the laughter, paradoxically, helped them sit still. Sometimes, when the exposure ended, the photographer would hand them a mirror so they could see themselves transformed into little gentlemen. These whimsical portraits became novelty sensations. Victorian parents adored them, proud of their bearded angels. Historians still argue whether these antics were merely playful distractions or subtle tools of discipline. Did they help children tolerate the stiffness of portraiture, or did they serve as early lessons in conformity, tiny rehearsals for the adult roles they were expected to grow into? The argument lingers in archives full of smiling miniature men, who look both amused and slightly confused. The sensory texture tightens around you, the boy's giggle turning into a hiccup, the faint scratch of wool from his oversized coat, the photographer's slow, rhythmic counting that fills the space like a lullaby. The fake beard, half the size of your hand, hangs crooked, but the exposure captures him mid-giggle, eyes wide and bright. And here's your gentle joke. You imagine the mother showing the finished photo to her friends, proudly saying, "He sat perfectly still," while the boy later insists, "That wasn't me, it was a pirate." When the session ends, the child waves goodbye to the beard, which now sits back on its peg, slightly frayed but somehow triumphant. In that fleeting moment, you realize that even the smallest prop in this peculiar trade could transform not only an image, but a mood, turning fear into laughter, stillness into a small act of play. The studio air is thick with the scent of chemical fixers and the soft crackle of drying plates. By now you've watched beards come and go, heroic, comic, dignified, and you've started to notice a pattern. Every illusion has its limit. Behind the glamour and glue, there are problems that not even the most clever beard can solve. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In the age before retouching tools, photographers relied on physical tricks to mask flaws. They might powder the skin to reduce shine, stuff cotton into collars for better posture, or even paint highlights and shadows directly on negatives. But there were limits. If a face lacked definition or the lighting flattened a jawline, no amount of pencil correction could recreate the fine, natural texture of hair. Hence, the beard, that faithful fixer. You watch the photographer hold up a finished print against the light, frowning. The subject looks slightly too pale, the contrast weak. "See?" he mutters. "If only he'd worn whiskers." It's true, without facial hair, the chin blurs softly into the neck, erasing any sense of form. The photograph feels ghost-like, fragile. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some photographers would draw beards directly onto negatives, using fine pencils or brushes dipped in dye. Others experimented with sprinkling graphite dust onto the plate before exposure to mimic subtle stubble. The results were mixed. One unfortunate gentleman in a Glasgow studio was immortalized with what reviewers later called a charcoal accident. Historians still argue whether such retouching by beard marked the beginning of photo manipulation or the last gasp of theatrical fakery. Was it an early form of digital editing in spirit, a technical necessity, or an aesthetic cheat? Some see it as the first inkling of photography's eternal dilemma: truth versus flattery. The sensory details close in, the soft rasp of the retouching brush over glass, the faint metallic scent of silver, and the quiet hum of concentration as assistants huddle over drying plates. Outside, the gaslights flicker to life, their glow mirrored faintly in the silver emulsion. The beard, it turns out, wasn't just vanity, it was texture, shadow, and depth incarnate. And here's your gentle joke. You imagine one exasperated photographer scrawling on his wall, "When in doubt, add whiskers." By the time the lamps are trimmed for the evening, you understand why these studios clung to their boxes of hair. In a world where every image was handcrafted chemistry, the false beard wasn't deception. It was a shortcut to realism, a way to trick the harsh mechanics of light into believing in humanity again. Night has settled outside, a slow drizzle tapping against the windows while the photographer locks up for the evening. You linger near a narrow doorway that leads to a smaller back room, a space few clients ever see. Here, under a single sputtering gas lamp, is where the secret life of those whiskers unfolds. Rows of wooden drawers line the wall, each neatly labeled imperials, goatees, sailors, scholars. Inside, they rest like sleeping creatures waiting for their next transformation. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Hygiene and maintenance were constant challenges in 19th century studios. False beards were shared between countless clients, day after day, affixed with sticky gums and pulled loose again. Studios tried to keep up with cleaning, combing, steaming, and dusting them between sittings, but there was no regulation, and standards varied wildly. In some cases, assistants even brushed lice powder onto the hairpieces, just in case. The smell of the room is unforgettable, a mix of singed wool, vinegar, and faint perfume from the last client who wore one. You spot a metal kettle whistling softly on a small burner, where strands of coarse hair are being sterilized in clouds of fragrant steam. A young apprentice sits beside it, scrubbing another beard with soap flakes, his fingers pruned from the work. Here's the quirky tidbit. To keep the whiskers organized, some studios stored them in tin boxes like cigars, each tagged with the name of the last sitter. There's something faintly ridiculous, and oddly human, about the sight of a shelf labeled Mr. Pennington, respectable chin tuft, medium brown. In one famous Paris studio, a cat reportedly made its bed on a box of unused mustaches, scattering them like snow each morning. Historians still argue whether hygiene concerns ever truly deterred clients. Were sitters blissfully unaware, or simply too vain to care? Letters from the period hint that most didn't ask questions. A moment of discomfort was a small price to pay for dignity preserved in silver. But one early critic wrote disdainfully that the modern gentleman's likeness is oft constructed from another's hair. The sensory details tighten, the hiss of steam, the scrape of a comb through damp fibers, the soft clink of a tin box snapping shut. The air tastes faintly metallic, and every surface glistens with moisture. You picture the beards drying overnight on thin wires, suspended like strange fruit, each destined to be reborn under a different chin by morning. And here's your gentle joke. You imagine one apprentice labeling a stray bundle. Miscellaneous beard, unclaimed. May contain philosopher. By the time the last lamp is extinguished, You realize these shared whiskers aren't just props. They're artifacts of intimacy, worn close to the skin, trading tiny fragments of one person's life with another's. A small, absurd exchange sealed forever in photographs that never revealed the secret. The next morning brings laughter, something rare in this work-worn studio. As the first shafts of sunlight pierce through the skylight, a young apprentice bursts in holding a small stack of newly developed prints. "You've got to see these," he wheezes between chuckles. You lean closer and there it is, a gallery of familiar faces, but not solemn, noble, or dignified. These are portraits of mischief. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the 1880s and 1890s, the rise of cheap dry plate photography and postcard printing made humorous or gag portraits wildly popular. Studios began offering light-hearted sessions where clients posed in outlandish costumes, swapped clothes, or borrowed fake beards purely for laughs. For the first time, photography wasn't only about preserving respectability, it was about sharing amusement. The photographs the apprentice fans out are ridiculous. A pair of bankers in borrowed military beards saluting with umbrellas. Two sisters sporting curly mustaches while pretending to duel with feather dusters. An elderly matron in an enormous fake goatee, her expression somewhere between saintly and sinister. The photographer shakes his head, muttering that serious portraiture is dying, but even he can't hide his smile. Here's the quirky tidbit. These playful sittings sparked a short-lived craze for comic cartes. Studios printed the images on small postcards that customers mailed to friends, complete with captions like, "A new man entirely," or "Meet my distinguished cousin." Some even glued miniature tufts of real hair onto the cards for extra absurdity. In Paris, one prank-loving photographer hosted Whisker Week, inviting customers to create the silliest portraits possible. His window display reportedly stopped traffic. Historians still argue whether this shift marked photography's democratization or its decline into frivolity. Did the camera lose its gravitas when people started laughing at it, or did it finally become human? Some scholars call this the first moment photography learned to wink at itself, a quiet rebellion against its own pretensions. The sensory world bursts alive. The tang of freshly printed paper, the giggles of clients queuing outside, the faint hum of a hand-cranked fan stirring the warm, chemical-scented air. You can almost hear the click of the shutter between fits of laughter, the photographer trying, and failing, to maintain his stern professionalism. And here's your gentle joke. You imagine one gentleman mailing his comic portrait to a friend with the note, "At last, I've grown respectable hair. It's detachable." By the time the afternoon sun angles low across the studio floor, the air feels lighter than it has in weeks. The false beards still hang along the wall, but their meaning has shifted again. No longer disguises for dignity, they've become instruments of play, props for laughter, reminders that photography's truest gift isn't just immortality, but the joy of pretending, if only for a moment, to be someone else entirely. Evening drapes itself softly across the studio, and for once, no new clients arrive. The photographer, sleeves rolled up, moves slowly among the racks of costumes and the pegs of well-used whiskers, humming under his breath. You can feel the quiet change in the air, the end of an era perhaps. The racks look tired, the false beards frayed from years of glue, laughter, and pretense. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the late 19th century, the age of prop beards was fading fast. Advances in camera technology, faster shutters, improved lenses, and more sensitive film meant exposure times dropped from minutes to mere seconds. Sitters no longer needed to freeze like statues, and the sharp contrasts of natural hair could finally be captured in detail. The old tricks of disguise were becoming obsolete. You run your fingers along the rough bristles of one beard that's turned gray from repeated cleanings. It feels oddly human, despite being nothing but stitched horsehair. Once, it had transformed hundreds of faces, lent dignity to boys, courage to veterans, humor to pranksters. Now it hangs limp in the quiet, irrelevant in a world moving too quickly for make-believe. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some old photographers couldn't bear to part with their props. A few even kept their favorite beards displayed in frames, labeled like trophies. Used on over 200 sitters, 1861 to 1874, One eccentric Parisian claimed his collection was haunted, insisting that the most popular beard retained the souls of the vain. Others sold them off to stage companies or novelty shops, where they lived on in pantomimes and parlor jokes. Historians still argue whether the fall of the prop beard represents photography's maturation or the loss of something charmingly human. Did the art form grow up, trading whimsy for precision, or did it abandon a kind of magic, the playful theater that made the still image feel alive? The debate, like the scent of old spirit gum, lingers faintly even now. The sensory details soften, the faint ticking of the studio clock, the creak of floorboards as the photographer lifts the last beard from its hook, the hush of fabric as he folds it into a wooden trunk. Outside, the city hums with the sound of trams and motorcars, the future arriving at walking speed. The beards will not be needed there. And here's your gentle joke, you imagine the photographer muttering to himself. Soon the cameras will be so fast, they won't even need faces. He snuffs the lamps one by one until only the faint blue light from the window remains. In the dimness, you can almost see the ghosts of every sitter, bearded or not, lingering for a moment before fading back into memory. What began as a strange trick of vanity now feels like a small miracle, a century's worth of borrowed identities, immortalized in silver and shade. The lamps are cold now, their glass still faintly warm to the touch. The smell of glue, dust, and singed horsehair has thinned to almost nothing. You breathe out slowly, and the quiet feels enormous, as if the studio itself is holding its breath. Somewhere, on a shelf, a wooden box of old beards sits closed for good. Inside lie hundreds of lives layered together, each one a whisper of pretense, laughter, and pride. Men who wanted to look wiser. Women who wanted to play. Children who just wanted to stop crying long enough for the shutter to click. Every borrowed whisker tells a story that now sleeps beneath the surface of forgotten photographs. You picture the studio years later, dust motes dancing through pale light, walls yellowed with time. A visitor opens that box and smiles, not mockingly, but tenderly. The beards seem silly now, yet there's something sweet about them, an age when people still believed they could shape their image with a brush, some glue, and imagination. Let yourself drift there for a moment, in that quiet room between centuries. The scent of resin and silver fades, replaced by calm. The air feels slower, softer, like velvet settling on your thoughts. You can almost hear the faint click of an old camera, freezing time just once more. Take one more breath in, steady and gentle. Exhale the noise of the day. The props are hung, the portraits finished, the light fading. And as the last echo of the shutter dissolves into silence, you rest, unmasked, unposed, simply still.